Welcome to the Bite Pod, where we today have our special guest, Cindy Allen. Cindy, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Cindy is an expert in global trade compliance and logistics with many years of experience navigating the complexities of customs regulation and supply chain management. She has held leadership roles in both government and private sectors, including as the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Cindy's experience spans areas such as Deminimis compliance, e-commerce, customs modernization, and cross-border logistics. And as a thought leader in the industry, Cindy is a sought-after speaker, and we're so excited to have her here with us. So before we move on to the day's topic, just very quickly, want to mention the Byte platform. Byte is a screening platform designed to streamline compliance and risk management by providing access to comprehensive data sets on high-risk entities, commodities, and trade compliance regulations. So with that, Cindy will jump into our first question here, and just kind of generally would love to hear from you on the trade compliance side, what you're seeing across different domains. We've talked with you about forced labor, de minimis. What are you seeing and what messaging do you have for our listeners?
Thanks. Thanks so much. And I'm really happy to be here supporting you guys. Big fan of Tariffs and thanks for having me here. So what happened in 2024 enforcement? I think that encapsulates everything we need to know about 2024 so far. Heavy on enforcement. I know when this current administration came in, everyone was expecting a softening of the enforcement approach, a repeal of some of the tariffs, maybe taking a little bit more measured approach to enforcement. And one of the things that I think we all learned and remembered was that, Democrats and Republicans traditionally, Republicans have been very pro-trade, and Democrats have been more focused on the U.S. manufacturing aspect. And we kind of forgot that because the Republicans moved to a less than, supportive trade posture. And what we saw was that the current administration didn't soften their approach. In fact, I think enforcement got gradually more important to them over the course of the 4 years. What does that mean? That means, forced labor continued to be a huge concern. We've seen not only forced labor in what we traditionally thought of in the textile industry and the cotton industries coming out of China, but also expanded across the globe and expanded to many more commodities as the time went on. And that's presented some significant challenges, I think, for international trade. We saw a lot of the traffic over the past 5-6 years move from a business to business environment to a business to consumer environment, and sometimes a consumer to consumer environment. And we're talking about small, medium-sized enterprises who now have the ability to sell internationally. And that was facilitated by some of the technology improvements that U.S. Customs and Border Protection made over the past 6 years. So I think that as we saw that traditional volume from business to business environment morph into what we now see 92% of all the volume coming into the United States is small package. It is small value, low value shipments. And the typical value of those are $25. So it's dropped even from the past several years from $55 to $25 per shipment on average. So these are very small packages coming in, but driven by consumer behavior. And that's presented a big challenge for CBP, not just in forced labor, but also how do they look at de minimis overall? De minimis is anything under $800 that's not subject to a trade remedy, such as anti-dumping duty, such as additional duties. Those areas in de minimis have completely overshadowed the business to business environment. 1.3 billion shipments coming into the de minimis environment versus around 55 million in a normal business to business environment, or over $2,500. And I think that it's presenting a lot of challenges to CBP.
And hey, listeners, this is Tarek. Really happy to have Cindy on, and yeah, that just just amazing insights on the changes and stuff, and Cindy, what in 2024, who obviously we know importers and exporters with importers especially for forced labor, but who in the supply chain do you think really has to kind of maybe change the way they look at their operations from the de minimis aspect? So we know CBP on the enforcement side, but who in that's the brokers, the forwarders, like who's really kind of got to step up here and try to work on that aspect?
I think the easy answer is everyone, but I think it's in different degrees. Yes, it's a huge enforcement issue for CBP, and that's because they've always had this business to business approach. Big container comes in, they know who to call at the big box retailer if they have an issue or a question. If it's they desire to examine it, they can open the box. It goes to a warehouse somewhere they know. And the business to business environment, that's really easy. In the de minimis, not so much, unless you're in a express environment where they're used to presenting package by package and customs requests any exam package by package. That really is a challenge for CBP. That leads to them wanting more data, and which is the big issue, I think, for everyone else in the supply chain. How do we get that data? I think the way shipments are coming in now is we're in the middle of the next big change. The last big change we had like this is when actual shipments came in on containerization, before it was bulk in crates. And then you had containerization happen. That was a massive change to how everyone had to act. And I think this going into the de minimis and the per package piece in the e-commerce environment is the next big change. So everyone has to change their policies. Everyone has to change their approach. From the importer side, in the traditional import environment, you have a rich data history. So, typically, your tier one, tier two suppliers, you can get information from them. So it hasn't been as big a lift for some of the larger importers. Where we see a lot of issues are marketplaces. Marketplaces wasn't a thing, 20 years ago. But it kind of was. If you think about, I'm almost 60. I grew up, in Indiana where we didn't have a lot of big, retail environments. So what do we do when school time came along and we wanted to order our school clothes? We went to the J.C. Penney catalog or the Sears catalog and we ordered our stuff and it came in. To me, e-commerce is just the electronic version of a catalog, only you have millions of them at your fingerprint and at your fingertips via your phone, and you can order anything anywhere and it gets here pretty quickly. So to me, it's everything old is new again, but with just a new slant. So we have this new environment needing new information so that CBP can do their job. And that means not only do I, as the person, importing that good, have to know what it is. I have to know where it came from because of some of these issues with forced labor, IPR violations, some of the anti-dumping duty, circumvention that is happening across the globe. CBP continues to talk about drugs coming in from different areas. Although, yes, there's always a security component to this. However, we know that a lot of the drugs coming in the United States are still coming in through the southern border in passenger environment, not in cargo, although they still find some stuff in cargo. But they are seeing some concerning patterns coming in the de minimis. So CBP is always looking at that from security. So how does that affect the different parties? In the marketplaces, they've just been a platform before. They, match buyers and sellers, they host the product, they're a technology concern usually. And CBP is forcing them to participate because they are a vital link into how those goods are sold into the United States. So early in, this administration, they reached out and said, "Hey, we want these different parties to the transaction," is what they're calling them, "to participate in filing information." So how do they do that? Well, they don't have an available platform to do that, to file directly with CBP, because you have the carriers, you have the importers, and you have the customs brokers that are providing that information. So how does CBP reach back into that marketplace to find that data that they really need? And then going beyond that, if you have a cotton shirt, you've imported a cotton shirt or you ordered a cotton shirt, and it's made in China. Well, for those of us in the trade industry, we know made in cotton made in China, there's a high likelihood that that has forced labor, because 80% of the cotton in China comes from Xinjiang region, which is, the subject of a forced labor. It's subject of the UFLPA law. And so how does that information flow through from the marketplace to CBP, and how do those individuals who are selling those goods, how do they know, or how do they trace that data? So that's a huge issue. I think we're all trying to solve right now how to tap that data, how to make it prove what you need to prove, whether you're on the government side or whether you're on the private side, and how does that feed into customs? Because right now it's kind of clunky. You get all these different systems. And as a customs broker, which I've been for all of my life since I was 22, as a customs broker, I'm responsible for that data in the de minimis environment. If I'm filing that data, I'm responsible for it. So it's a higher level of responsibility than customs brokers have ever had, because they have to have visibility into that product. So we're all a little nervous. And we want tools like yours so that we can understand how that information flows, what that data is, and how that can ensure that companies, especially that are participating in the de minimis environment, are being compliant, because there are compliant companies out there, but they have to prove it now, because of some of the laws.
Right, right. No, it makes total sense. And, I think we'll also see, well, there's been communication that product descriptions will be, super important as well. So, I think that ha having technology that can, map that HTS code, not just take the kind of generic description, but then also get, an appropriate description per CBP guidelines is super important.
Yeah, and we saw the quality of the data became a focus. And I know there's been some press globally in the international trade arena about some attempted attacks with one of the express carriers, where they handled several shipments that actually caught fire in different environments. And that precipitated a lot of review of the data. And TSA, working with CBP, working with their international partners, determined that there were some patterns that they were looking for, but they didn't have the data to be able to discern that pattern in the shipping information. So they began a huge push to raise the quality of the data that is filed to U.S. Customs by carriers on the manifest, and then also in the other environments by the customs brokers who are filing the Type 86 de minimis data. So I think that's been a huge push, and I think it's difficult for all of the participants. I will tell you, having worked at 2 express carriers, that quality of the data relies on, a lot of times somebody going into an express carrier office and saying, "I'm going to ship this sweatshirt." And that's all they know. They don't know what it is. They don't know who made it, but they're going to ship it to their, sister who lives overseas, or they're going to ship it to themselves. I've been overseas and gone shopping and maybe bought a little much, then I want to carry in my suitcase. And, you go and you describe it as best you can. That presents a challenge when customs is looking for, I need to know this is 100% cotton made in the United States, women's sweatshirt. That's the level of data that they want to know now. And so it's a balance of, what information your clients are giving you and how you can then make sure that's enough for customs and other authorities to do their job. So it's a huge quality push right now, really driven by security needs.
Right, right. No, it makes total sense. And, one thing I've noticed, so, most of my career I was kind of in the either national security, homeland side, a lot of what you're familiar with. But recently, kind of working more in the commercial side of supply chain, I do notice, there's these, I guess every quarter, every 6 months, there's this very focused attention on something in particular, and everyone kind of starts to divert towards that. I think this last year we saw, forced labor, then, Deminimis coming in now. What are you kind of seeing for the next 12 to 18 months? What are those big ticket things going to be?
I don't think you can talk about what's coming without saying the word tariffs. It's in the news. It continues to be in the news. The new administration has made very clear their intent to put some level of tariffs. There's a lot of discussion on whether that will happen, what form it'll take, how that will roll out, how much time we'll have. And I think that anyone who tells you that they know what's going to happen is lying, because no one knows what's going to happen. If we measure the coming administration by the last one, where things happened literally on a Monday and had to be implemented on Friday, we just don't know what's going to happen. There's been a lot of talk of, that would never happen. They're not going to put a 10% tariff on everything. They're not going to put a 25, percent tariff on Canada and Mexico. It's a negotiation tactic. I think that if you are in international trade, a couple of things you need to know. Watch the news, have a trusted advisor that you can go to, that is going to say, okay, these are the scenarios that could happen. Let me help you walk through what your response would be if that does happen, because, preparation is key here. Knowing your supply chain, you have to know it, whether that means you're in, you can only go so far back in your supply chain, your supplier, your third, fourth tier don't really want to tell you that information. There are tools out there that can help you understand that. Understand not just the products you're bringing in, but all the components that are going into that. That's part of knowing your supply chain and understanding if that has a risk to it. If there are actions taken on components to a product, you need to know what your components are, and not everyone does. So I think those are a couple of things. And, technologies. You need to have technologies at your fingertips that are going to help you understand what you have in your supply chain. What are the classifications, not just of your products, but your components? Who are the parties to the transaction? Do they have any red flags? Are there any issues that you need to be aware of in that? Where are they manufacturing? Because a lot of companies that they buy, they don't know their, fourth and fifth tier might be manufacturing in a concerning country. And not just from a tariff perspective, but geopolitically, are there issues that you need to know about that you don't, that are going to interrupt a supply chain coming forward? So I think, partnerships, technology, and just understanding how possible scenarios could impact your products.
Thanks, Cindy. And it sounds like preparation is key, and especially going into a new administration, even more so. One question that we get a lot is if I start doing my preparation now and I find something, what should I do? What do I do about that? Now that I'm kind of left wondering, like, oops, that was a mistake. Do we call
Well,
you?
I think yeah, yeah. I was going to say, I think it depends on the level of the oops.
Yep.
Some oopses require a call to your competent customs counsel. And I always recommend, if you have a general counsel in your company, yes, go to them. But they are general for a reason. Contact a competent customs or international trade attorney if you find an oops that is big, because you want to have some legal advice. Also, they act under client confidentiality, so they aren't subject to, subpoenas and things like that. If you aren't quite sure what that oops is, a lot of times that's where I see a lot of companies calling me, is like, we think there's something there, but we aren't quite sure what it is. We found a little thing, but we need to know, what else is out there. My company specializes in risk assessments. So we come in, we do a review, a high level review, and say, okay, these areas we think you're good. This area, maybe not so much. That area, let's call attorney. So let's talk to them. So that's what my company does. And we reach out and work with companies like yours to understand the data and understand what is there, to help our importer clients to actually meet that need.
Yeah, and that's so important from a compliance perspective, and having someone guide you and stuff is critical. And even our hope is that as technology gets better as well, some of those smaller, very small, 1, 2 person exporters can get their hands on the right data as well. And I mean, even something like ChatGPT these days, it's a starting point, right? It shouldn't be the thing that makes your final determination, but so yeah, and it's kind of pivoting a little bit away from supply chain or customs in particular, but you've had a very successful career both in the government and private sector. Um, you know, uh, I think it's really fantastic, being able to talk to someone who's gone down that path and can maybe share tips for other people in the government looking to move to the private sector, getting to that part in their career where, they're thinking about a move. But what do you think helped you be successful from that regard?
Well, I started in the private sector, and I was in the private sector for 20 years before I went to the government. And I was a rare person in the government in that I had the component, the head of the component backing me in turning around ACE. At that time, it was a huge $4 billion project. They'd spent, almost 3.5 billion and had 30% of the system out. I'm not a tech person, but I'm a business person, and I know how to say, here's what I want and need from technology to assist me in what I need to do. So I was brought in kind of with that lens that I would help refocus that agency's technology needs. Um, and I was only there for 3 years. So I went back out into the private sector. Since then, I've had a lot of my government, colleagues and partners call me and say, hey, I want to go out into the private sector. I would say, don't be afraid to take risks. Especially if you're talking about a situation where you have 20 plus years with the government and you can retire from the government, you have a little bit more leeway. So you need to look at it as, what are my possibilities here? So don't be afraid to take risks. I've been in several different phases of my career. I started as a customs broker on the northern border. I went into compliance from there, operations to compliance, which a lot of us do. But then I went and worked for a trade association for 2 years and got to know the whole industry and the government aspect a little bit more, and then worked for the government, and got to see that from the inside, and then came back out and worked in a government kind of facing position. So I've kind of seen different aspects. So I think you have to look at from the government's perspective, especially if you've been there your whole career, what skills do I have that can translate to the private sector? Um, you know, Resume writing and presenting your skills and interviewing on the government side is extremely different than on the private sector side. And I know you probably know that from being in the government yourself. It's a lot different. So reach out to resources, reach out to your friends and say, I need help with this. I need help with my resume. There are companies who specialize in doing that for you and can help you with that. And then the third thing is, a lot of government people are driven by the need to serve the public. They want to serve. That's why they're there. Yes, they want a career. Yes, they're ambitious. Yes, they, want to have a successful, career, but they do that because they want to make a difference. And that's completely different from the private sector. You are driven by wanting to make a difference in the public sector. When you get to the private sector, it's completely different. Yes, you want to make a difference, but you have to make money doing that. And I find that a lot of conversations I have with folks coming out of the government is how they can make money and how they can do that, because they've never really thought in terms of, hey, how much does this cost? How much do I have to make it viable? The return on investment calculation is a lot different in the private sector. So I think understanding that and going to not necessarily jumping into, I want to start my own company, is not necessarily the best thing. I always tell those folks who've been government sector all their life, go somewhere where you can learn how to make money, because that's really what drives the private sector. Yes, you want to work for a company, and I see a lot of government folks morphing to companies that are making a difference and that are, gonna really be able to change an industry. So that really is important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I didn't have as stellar of a career, nor was I as high up as you in the government. But I think one thing I would add also from the tech perspective is, an architect or a solutions engineer in the government doesn't necessarily mean you can be one in the private sector. It's a vastly different kind of landscape and skill set in many cases. So I think, being very aware of what the job requirements are if you do switch is, I think, important, because they do, those standard OPM kind of position descriptions say a lot compared to, the private sector. But yeah, I found that was an interesting experience for me too. Um, and actually, pivoting back to CBP a bit, I have an immense amount of respect for OIT and the folks over there, as well as the business owners. Where are you seeing CBP from an IT and modernization standpoint? What are you kind of hearing, and where are you seeing the agency go in that perspective?
I think they're at a turning point right now too. ACE was a massive, federal acquisition program
Mm.
that, got in trouble and then had to be pulled back. And, I was honored to be a part of that, pulling back and making it viable and getting it over the, the hump there. But I think that what the government technology has really shown is that the private sector is much more able to provide value to the international trade arena specifically. So I really see ACE as a mechanism of interface with companies that have technology that provide information. I don't really see the government, especially, CBP, moving forward with a major acquisition. In fact, they've said that they are not going to do another acquisition for ACE 2.0. It's going to be a continuation of the current acquisition process. But that means, limited funding, limited visibility. So if I am the government and I'm sitting there saying, I need better information, how do I get that? And I have limited means to do that. I'm going to reach out to companies like yours and say, what do you have? How can we interface? Do you have clients that are interested in doing that with us? And I think that we're going to see a lot of these pilots that are ongoing just explode. We're going to see many more pilots based on technology companies being able to actually deliver something that's valuable to both CBP and the international trade arena, both, and that they'll move forward doing that. A concern that we have on the trade side is when you have a pilot like that and you have 2 or 3 participants, which is great in a conceptual process. Hey, I need to change this thing. I need to, adjust that. It's fantastic. But when it comes out of a pilot and it opens up, the trade really needs to have an opportunity to look at that and say, does this work across the board? Can we implement this? What else is needed in this environment? And I think CBP is struggling with that a little bit right now. they are trying to move from an acquisition-based type of approach to a more nimble type of approach that allows different parties to come in, but how do you do that in a manner that allows everyone to have, kind of a comment on, does this work for everybody? And it's fine if it doesn't, but you need to know what are then the alternatives out there. So I think it's an adjustment for CBP that they're making right now. And I think with, the possibility of some budgetary restrictions that might be coming in with the new administration and some pressure to kind of reduce costs and provide higher stakeholder value, there's going to be a review at some point of CBP's technology and saying, how does this work overall government wide? CBP has a very big computer system, probably the biggest in the government, and one of the biggest in the world, that takes in all this international trade data. And I think one of the things that I'll be watching is, does a government accountability office or another government review really change that approach? Because we've been fortunate in international trade that, we have one agency that we deal with, even though we say, yes, you have all these other government agencies, it still goes through CBP for the most part. And we want to make sure that that is maintained and that they have the resources to continue to develop as technology is needed, and do it quicker. So I'm hoping any kind of review like that will show more resources, will enable the international trade and the government to respond more quickly to changes, whether in security or trade enforcement areas, and get that technology out there. So I'm hoping that a review keeps that in mind.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and we're seeing CBP start to use other, technologies in their processes, and even when I was in the government, 10 years ago, using external tools to run checks on government processes was unheard of. I remember the ICE privacy officer having a fit about, using, these really secure, safe technologies because it was happening outside of the IT environment. But I think I'm seeing a kind of culture change, both from, many of those platforms have security that's just as good as the government itself. And I think having trust in those agencies or those companies is starting to happen a bit more and more.
Yeah, I agree. It used to be, here's the firewall, everything happens
Yep.
behind it. And now they've realized that that's it's not a sustainable future for a technology programs. So
Mhm.
and let's face it, the government, and I was in charge of a system, so I can say this, the government's not exactly great at technology delivery. They're, and I blame that a lot on the federal acquisition rules, having been through that for 3 years. It's probably why I have to dye my hair. But that it causes just a lot of paperwork that doesn't make any sense. It made sense at some point because some government official didn't do something, and so there were additional restrictions placed somewhere along the way, which made sense for that one thing. But if you think about it, when I was in ACE, I had a team of like 5 people, and all they did is write reports. 5 people writing reports day in and day out, congressional reports, oversight reports, government GAO reports, technology reports, all the things. And they made sense independently, but together it just seemed like there was an opportunity there to use those resources a little more effectively. So we'll see where it's going.
Yeah, and from the enforcement standpoint, being able to prove that you found the right person in the right database, presenting that, I remember HSI going through those situations. I think those, your case won't collapse, I don't think, if you bring the data artifact from a secure commercial database versus a government one. I'm not a lawyer at all by any means, but I remember that being a particularly important aspect for enforcement as well.
Yeah, the again, we're back at data quality.
Hmm.
What's the data quality here, and then what action can I take based on that data quality? So I think it's, whether you're talking about security or whether you're talking about commercial information,
Right.
your action is only as good as the data that it's based on. I remember one of my most favorite moments at CBP was we were in a huge meeting, and I'm not, I'm come from a civilian background. I'm not, government. I'm not law enforcement. I didn't have a Leo, job description. And I remember being with Commissioner Burson, and we were around the table with all of his, top officials. So all the deputy commissioner, all the assistant commissioners, everyone. And I remember him going around the room saying, "What is CBP?" And, they were like, "Oh, we're the largest law enforcement agency in the United States," which is true. We are the ones who are, the tip of the spear at the border. We act on all the other agencies, absolutely. We're that, we're the trade enforcer. We, enforce all the trade laws on behalf of all of our partners, and we share that information internationally. Absolutely. And then he looked at me and he said, "Cindy, what do you think?" And I'm like, I don't know. I'm the new person in the room. I have no idea what to say here. And he said, "We are a data company." And everyone was, kind of scoffed at that. And that was 15 years ago. And you look now, and they are a data agency. Everything that they do relies on the data. Everything that all the statistics, data, all of the, hey, targeting relies on data. It looks at patterns. Everything they do relies on data. And I just thought that was really a cool insight when technology wasn't that cool, 15 years ago. Now it seems like we've turned the corner, and the government thinks that data is cool. They understand how to unleash that. And I think that, he was kind of a visionary in understanding that you had to make the system work for you, because that was central to the mission of the agency, is getting all that data and understanding what they needed to do. So, I think he kind of made the data side cool for everyone. And it really did allow a lot of the technology companies to kind of think about things a little bit differently, and have that opportunity. So I've always, been a data person, even though I'm not a tech person.
Yeah, yeah. I remember I didn't know how immense CBP's data, ecosystem was. I remember, Jim McLaughlin invited me to a TASPO meeting once, and I forget one of the architects just kind of said, "Yeah, we swap with Deutsche Bank as the largest transactional database in the world." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know that." That's a big deal. So, yeah, it's crazy, but that's a great way to put. I've heard Capital One describe themselves as a tech company that does banking. So that's, that tech data first approach is interesting. But and I've done most of the questions on our side. Did you have
Yeah.
anything else for Cindy?
No, this has been a great conversation, and I think that's the CBP as a data company is really interesting. I think for all of our listeners too, if anyone's still questioning if they should be collecting more data on their end as, an importer or an exporter, you've heard it here. CBP is a data company, so I'd recommend, collecting that and keeping track of it. But I don't have any other questions for you, Cindy. Do you have any final insights for our listeners?
No, just 2025, all bets are off. So keep all of your industry resources close, as we continue through this next year. And I know you guys will bring some interesting capabilities to the market next year that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, yeah, we're excited, and I'm looking forward to bumping into you at a conference, hopefully. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and hope you have happy holidays, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.